As you see, our scripture today includes 2 or 3 verses from each of the first 3 chapters of Hosea. Hosea 1, verses 2 and 3. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go, marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Hosea 2, verses 13 through 16. I will punish her for the days she burned incense to the Baals. She decked herself with rings and jewelry and went after her lovers. But me she forgot, declares the Lord. Therefore, I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards and will make the valley of Acre a door of hope. There she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband. You will no longer call me my master. Hosea 3, verses 1 to 3. The Lord said to me, "Go, show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes." So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver, and about a homer and a lethek of barley. Then I told her, "You are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way toward you."
Good morning. I'm an elder at Eastside here, and most Sundays I'm actually with the kids. And we've been doing Song of Solomon, as y'all know, and so the running joke is that we've been doing puppets. So I don't know if some of you that don't have small kids probably don't know that. So Jeff asked me if I would be bringing a puppet today, and so I got our puppet and brought it, and y'all are going to have a puppet show. I'm kidding. But anyways, thought that would be good. So often on weekends, my family, we like to gather around and watch a movie. A lot of you all do that too, have a movie night. And this Friday, we were watching a movie. I didn't plan to throw this in the sermon, but it was perfect. And we were watching an action-adventure movie. I won't tell you which one. And there was a love story central to the plot. And my kids are like, "Oh, Dad, do we have to watch this?" And anyways, so there's this scene in the movie. Imagine 2 teenagers talking and confessing their love to one another. The boy, "From the moment I met you all those years ago, not a day has gone by when I haven't thought of you. And now I'm with you, I'm in agony. The closer I get to you, the worse it gets. The thought of not being with you, I can't breathe. I'm haunted by the kiss that you should never have given me. My heart is beating, hoping that the kiss will not become a scar. You're in my very soul, tormenting me. What can I do? I will do anything that you ask. If you're suffering as much as me, please tell me." The girl, "I can't. We can't. It's just not possible." The boy, "Anything's possible, Padme. I mean, listen to me." The girl, "No, you listen. We live in a real world. Come back to it. You're studying to become a Jedi, and I'm a senator. If you follow your thoughts through to conclusion, they will take us to a place we cannot go, regardless of the way we feel about one another." The boy, "Then you do feel something." You should have seen my kids. They were rolling their eyes, gagging, this kind of thing. And like, that's not the way it really is. And then I thought back to when I was first pursuing Haley, and I wondered if I was that miserable without her. And the answer is yes. And I probably said many of the same things. Someday we're going to have to pull out our backpack with all our love letters and read them to one another. The kids can't see those. Mark's been talking about the Song of Songs, and it is notably about the exclusive relationship between a man and his wife. And we're going to look at a different love story today, the book of Hosea. And whereas Song of Songs hints at Jesus' relationship with his people, this book points directly to God's love for his people. Mark recently said in a sermon, God is smitten with you. He wants to pour out his love on you so that you might become beautiful. He wants to make you beautiful. Here in Hosea, we find this different story, as I said, but I need to give you a little background and context before we jump into the book. The book of Hosea is broken into two parts. Chapters 1 through 3 tells the story of Hosea and his wife Gomer. And then chapters 4 through 14 are books of poetry. They're not sequential. They're scattered over many years. And so if you read it, you might get a little confused. We're going to focus on 1 through 3. Based upon Hosea 1:1, which we didn't read, this book was written about 30 years prior to Assyria invading Samaria in 722 BC. So Hosea is a contemporary of Amos. Both these prophets are talking to Israel, trying to address their idolatry and their wickedness. It's into this context that Hosea steps, but God asks him to do something utterly scandalous, if you were paying attention to the verses. Now let me pause here and teach you something I learned a few years ago from the singer, writer, theologian Michael Card. Some of y'all know him. He wrote the song, Thy Word, El Shaddai. But he's a professor in Nashville, actually, a seminary professor. He said that we often approach the Bible like a history book. We kind of see it as something happened way back then. We don't really see the reality of the story. Or we can approach the Bible like a fairy tale. We heard about Moses parting the Red Sea, right? But we don't really see two walls of water divided and us walking through them. But both approaches, I think, are wrong to some degree. Michael Card suggests that we use a thing called the informed imagination. And so what we do is we take what we know about the text factually, and then we engage our imaginations and step into the story. And so that's what I want you to do today. My sermon is 3 points. The first point is a love story. Second is a lust for idols. And the third, in your bulletin, it's messed up, is the allure of love. But let's pray. God, I just ask that you would help us to see your love for us this morning, how you came and sacrificed yourself for us. We've sang about it in the songs just a few minutes ago, but help us to feel that love. Help us to be convicted of all the ways that we run away from you and to hear the allure of your love. I pray this in your precious holy name. Amen. Once upon a time, there were two people. They fell in love in the ancient land of Samaria. Now, these two people came from two different worlds altogether. There was Hosea, the devout prophet, who was committed to his work. And then there was Gomer, a beautiful woman, the kind of woman that would draw your eye when she walked into the room, but she was part of the party scene. Somehow, they fall in love, they get married, and Hosea assumes that although she had this wild background, that maybe she'll settle down now. Maybe they'll live happily ever after. But she's given herself away to too many lovers, and her heart is still divided, and everything doesn't go the way he expects. Now, he's a prophet tasked with saving a nation, and so maybe he's committed to his work. Maybe he spends too much time on that, and his work is really not that important to her. So they drift slowly apart. Her heart starts to wander, and she returns to her old way of life. Now imagine you're Hosea. Night after night, you wait for your wayward wife to return home, and so you pray about it. You bring it before the Lord, and then maybe your prayer was answered. Gomer gets pregnant, and they have a baby. And so there he is, holding his first baby boy in his arms, and his hope is renewed. Maybe this will draw Gomer back to him. But Gomer doesn't change. Maybe she tries sometimes, but the change does not go deep enough, and she continues to find and run off with different lovers. And Hosea is left at home with their boy. He is named Jezreel, which means to cast something away or to throw it away. And he feels just like that in regards to his marriage. Not too long after, another baby girl is born, and she is named Lo Ruhamah, which means not loved. Then, following that, Gomer bears another son, and he's aptly named Lo Ami, which means not my people. I know these aren't popular names, but these were names that God told Hosea to name his children to reflect what was happening with Israel. But it also gives us insight into what was happening in his family. You see, these last two kids were probably not his own. But Hosea keeps loving her and chooses not to divorce her despite her choices. Then one day a surprise comes to Hosea. He returns home and finds that Gomer has left for good. Perhaps she's left a note. Little Jezreel comes into the room and says, "Where's Mommy?" tugging at his robe. And then he hears the babies crying in the other room. But Hosea keeps loving his wife. Maybe he hears about her from time to time. Maybe they cross each other on the street. He looks at her with love, but then she just turns her head and looks the other way. Finally, after many repeated affairs, Gomer eventually ends up on the streets, ends up with somebody that can't support her. And so she's found herself in poverty. Hosea hears about this and goes to the house where she's staying. Maybe the interchange happens something like this. Gomer leaves. Hosea walks up and knocks on the door. The man answers the door, her lover, and says, "Who are you?" "I'm Gomer's husband." The man steps back in surprise. "What do you want?" Hosea, "I love Gomer very much, but take this gift of silver and buy her some things that she needs." The man can't believe his eyes, but he takes the gift and shuts the door abruptly before Hosea can change his mind. Gomer returns later and finds out that somehow their needs have been met. She probably knows it's Hosea, but it doesn't change her. Hosea then decides that since she will not be drawn back by his love, that he will let trouble draw her to himself. And this is what happens. Hosea sinks lower and lower and eventually finds herself sold into slavery. You see, back then, slavery was a common practice for those that couldn't pay their debts. And so imagine this. Gomer would have found herself probably on an auction block, stripped, naked, so that everyone could see what they were buying. And so there she is, and I hear the auctioneer calling out, 50, 25, 15, and the crowd's silent. But then a voice arises out of the silence, firm and tender. "I'll give 15 pieces of silver and 18 bushels of barley." Gasps erupt from the crowd. They know this is her husband, and they know what she's done. And they think maybe she's going to get revenge laid out on her. Gomer opens her eyes, ashamed of who she is and what she's become. She's fearful of punishment. And Hosea approaches the auction block, takes his cloak, puts it over her shoulder, and leads her back home. When they arrive home, the house is uncannily silent, and Gomer sits down on a chair and looks to the corner. Hosea comes and kneels before her and raises her chin and looks into her eyes, and he says this, "You are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or intimate with any man, and I will behave the same towards you." And this is where the story ends. We don't know what happens next. Does that story move you? Are you revolted by it? I think maybe we should be revolted. I mean, Gomer just wouldn't stop. This is not a made-up story. This is a real story. And Hosea wouldn't stop loving her. We've seen marriages stained with adultery. We've seen people run off and keep on chasing pleasures. But what does all this story mean? We're told in the Bible that this scandalous but true story is about Israel's love affair with idolatry. Now, this is where I might lose you. This is point 2. Because, we think about idols and we think about back then. We were in Sunday school a few minutes ago and idolatry came up. And the speaker said, yeah, back then they worshipped animals and insects, which you could squash. And so that's what happens in my brain when I hear idolatry. I think about, little stone statues. Kids are talking about idolatry in children's church today, and they're probably going to talk about statues and idols and this kind of thing. Or maybe we've been warned about idolatry before, about the dangers of materialism, of our things, our cars, our watches, our iPad devices. And so we've heard that before too, and we know about the dangers of that. But Gomer's adulterous love holds much more relevance for us than we think. Recently, I was leading a Bible study in Acts, and Paul, it was said in the study that Paul, whenever he talked about the gospel, he would always first talk about idolatry. And what I realized is that I'm an idolater in so many ways. We probably don't really understand the gospel fully until we see how it opposes idolatry where it exists in our hearts. So think about it. What is idolatry, and what's your definition? There's a quote that's in your bulletin, but I'm going to throw it up on the slides too, in case you don't have a bulletin. And Tim Keller said this in a sermon: "If there's anything other than God that is functionally more important to your happiness, your identity, your meaning, or your hope, that is functionally your God. Idolatry is not doing bad things. It's making something good an ultimate thing." So have you ever said this in your mind? If I could have that, then I would be happy and have meaning. If so, like me, you're an idolater. Of course, bad things like materialism, drugs, sex, those kind of things can be idols. But more often than not, turning good things into ultimate things are the more sneaky idols that bind us to them and blind us to them. There are lots of examples of this. It could be your personal identity, it could be a man's work, our kids' happiness, or even our own religious pursuits. So once again, what's yours? Now, if you go back to Paul or Hosea's day, they had an idol in every corner. Idols for agriculture, war, sex, much like the guy was saying in Sunday school. See, they were more overt about it, but we often miss that. We're doing exactly the same thing. You know this because of how we spend our time and our money, our resources, or what controls us emotionally. I recently heard an example that stuck close to home in a sermon. I'll throw another quote up on the screen. Benjamin Nugent writes for the New York Times, and he wrote this on a blog. He said, "When my good writing was my only goal, I made the quality of my work the measure of my worth. For this reason, I wasn't able to read my own writing well. I couldn't tell whether something I had written was good or bad because I needed it to be good in order to feel sane. I lost the ability to cheerfully interrogate how much I like what I had written, to see what was actually on the page rather than I wanted to see or what I feared to see." In other words, he had made a good thing an ultimate thing. And the line that really caught me in that quote is where he says the quality of his work was the measure of his worth. Idols are harsh taskmasters, aren't they? We become slaves to them and we don't even realize it. Whether it be work, relationships, school, or love, everyone's just trying to justify themselves through something they're doing. There's an example that came to mind. I thought, I need to put an example in here because you've heard me talk, and stories are what kind of wakes me up when I'm listening. And so the training of a physician. If you want to be a doctor, you have to do really well in college, then you have to do really well in medical school, and then you have to do really well in residency. And you're always under the view of others. You're always being evaluated. I see Ward, the military is the same way. And after you arrive, you think that would go away, right? A doctor is done. Unfortunately, your daily habits are under the scrutiny of others, like colleagues, and your patients. How many of you want to see a physician that's not smart, or at least doesn't appear smart? None of you, right? I have these patient surveys that come into my inbox every month, and we do read the surveys, by the way. And it's interesting. I'm rated. All the doctors are rated. And then we're put under a star system. You can pull up how many stars I have later on Google if you want to. But every time I'm about to open that email, there's a little flitter of anxiety that comes over me. Because I start wondering, well, did I make somebody unhappy and not mean to? Did I communicate well? Are my patients going to leave me? And And, it shouldn't matter, but it does. You see, my identity as a physician becomes an idol pretty quickly. But the same can occur as my role as an elder or a teacher, a father, or a husband. Regardless, that idol can become a harsh taskmaster. Much like the weather, our happiness can fluctuate just like the weather did last week, right? Depending upon what is said about us. So do you see how you fall into this trap of idolatry? Ask yourself, where do you find your identity? A mom can be just a suspect. What do others think about her children, the home she's built, how she invests her time, what other moms think of her? Then there are those that spend countless hours working. They find an excuse to go back to the office or work a little bit longer. They feel good when others notice their contribution, and they find ultimate meaning in their work. Kids. It's funny, every time a pastor says kids wake up for about 2 seconds, and then I remember being the kid. But kids, this applies to you too. How much do you care about what others think about you at school? Are you willing to share Jesus with your friends even if you get laughed at? Are you willing to stand up for those that are bullied or just not cool? So how are you trying to justify yourself? Where are you investing your time? What idols are you giving yourself to? Do you lust after another God's approval? So this brings me to the last point of my sermon. We need something that's going to change our heart. And if you're like me, Mark did a series of sermons a few weeks ago, and it was prophet, priest, king. You remember that? Heart, mind, doing, action. So this is the action part of the sermon. And so the way my brain works, I look for the practical points in the sermon. If I ever listen to a sermon, I take notes on that part. I wake up. And so what do you do, right? Well, one response is what a pastor termed the love-less approach. You may choose, there's that idol thing, work. I'm just not going to love work as much. Or if you make your family an idol, I'm just not going to love my family as much. Doesn't sound right, does it? Or family, or whatever it might be. Whatever that idol is, you're going to seek approval less. But unfortunately, this doesn't work. I have a family member who struggles with addiction, and if you tell him to love alcohol less, which we have, it will work for a little while. You can guilt him or whatever, but he goes back to it. And addiction's different. I'm not trying to make addiction something small, those of you that struggle with addiction, but idolatry is a form of addiction. Ultimately, you run back to it. As we discussed before, an idol is a painful master, and it has little mercy for its slave. And so you can't beat it by loving it less. You need a greater love to come and supplant your heart. And this is where that scandalous, beautiful love story I told you a few minutes ago comes to bear so wonderfully. So now we're going to go back to the passage. And in chapter 2, there's that verse that was read. And it says this in verse 14. Therefore, I'm going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give back her vineyards and will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came out of Egypt. God, our true bridegroom, wants to allure and woo his bride back. I looked up the definition of the word allure this morning because I thought there's probably some people that don't know what allure means. And this is how allure was defined: the quality of being powerfully and mysteriously attractive or fascinating. How does God allure his people back? There's a clue in the passage. If you look, it says that he's going to allow Gomer to go into the valley of Achor. And you may not remember the valley of Achor. The valley of Achor is interesting because this is the first time Israel messed up after they got into the promised land. And there was a guy named Achan, and Achan stole some of the forbidden spoils and hid them away. And as a result, that valley, after the defeat of Ai, became a valley of trouble for them. But what all this means is that in the story, Hosea is going to allow Gomer to walk in that valley because he realizes that through her trouble, she'll start to hear his voice again. He'll be able to allure her. We know what happens in the story, right? Because I told it a few minutes ago, but she does hit rock bottom and finds herself a slave. She's up there on that auction block, being auctioned off before her husband speaks up. Do you see her standing there? Now, let me tell you another story. I'm going to be going to Brazil in a few days, as was prayed about. And one of the places we go is a place named Oito Preto. It means black 8. And it is one of the darkest places I've been on this earth. Drug lords, control it. And the missionaries are the light in the darkness in that area. What we usually do is we walk out and we do little medical clinics in people's houses. We walk through the community. We're very safe because we're with the missionaries, and they're well respected in the community. And so I was walking through, I think Abigail and Haley were with me. We were doing some house visits. And we walk past this house, and there's some smoke wafting out of the house, and people are in it. It's dirty. There's mattresses on the ground. And people are doing drugs in the back, we think. And this lady, she's kind of hiding off the side a little bit. She looks timid. She walked up to us and got the attention of the missionary, not the doctors, and kind of whispered and asked if I could talk to her. So we went off to the side. And she was a lady of the street, and the clothes were hanging off her. She was dirty appearing, lacking some teeth, and she just wanted something for a private infection. So think about that lady standing up on the auction block. This is where Gomer has found herself. And Hosea buys her back, and he redeems her in her ugliness and from her ugliness. Now let's go back to that last verse that I read you, chapter 3, verse 3, the end of the story. Then he told her, "You are to live with me many days, and you will not be a prostitute or intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way towards you." Now, Tim Keller, in one of his sermons, said that you can miss what's being said here, particularly with the English translation. And so he worked on translating it. So I'm going to lean on what he did here, give him due credit. So he says 3 things, Hosea. The first thing he says is, "I want to dwell with you." This is shocking. I mean, this is a lady of the street. This is that lady I just mentioned to you, and he wants to be her husband again. He wants to go home and build a home again with her. They're beautiful words. They're unexpected words. How could he want her now, much less want her as a wife again? The second thing he says is that for a set period of time, she's not supposed to be intimate with any man, but in the translation, you may miss that includes Hosea. I think that's neat because he's willing to wait. And what I think is being said is that he realizes that sin has a healing process. It takes time. I'm one of those automatic people. I want things right now, especially if there's something emotional. Let's just get over it and go do the next thing, ask Haley. But healing takes time. The last thing he says, the best thing he says, is he says, "I will indeed be yours." So what is he really saying? He doesn't just say that you are going to be mine. He says, "I'm going to be yours again." And this is an audacious statement. He's giving himself to her once again, just like a groom and a bride on their wedding day. He's renewing his vows before her. He loves her completely. He accepts her despite the good and the bad. And this is grace. Then there's a rub here in the next verses, which weren't read, which you may miss. How can he do this? We know Hosea is an image of God. We know Hosea was in love, and God was in love of his people. We know Hosea was betrayed, and God is betrayed by their idolatry. And we know that Hosea pays a price. But where does that happen to God? Where does God enter the marketplace and purchase his people off the auction block? And that answer, although cryptic, is in verses 4 and 5. I'll read those to you, or you can read with me. "For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. And afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord, their God, and David, their king. They will come trembling to the Lord to have his blessings in the last days. Verse 4 says there will be a period of time that they are not going to seek God. But then in verse 5, they return to God and seek him. They seek the Lord, their king, David. But wait, David's dead at this point in the Bible, right? So what is it doing? Of course, it's pointing to a descendant of David, right? Jesus enters the marketplace. Jesus comes down the aisle to sweep his long-lost bride off of her feet. She is the picture of our idolatrous hearts, and we are transformed by the cost he pays with his death on the cross. So how do we change our idolatrous hearts? As we sit on that chair and are ugly, sin, wayward, defiled, he raises our chin to look into our face with love. There's that old hymn, Softly and Tenderly, and it says, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. In that loving gaze, we're changed. Think back to your wedding or a wedding you've attended recently. See the bride and groom staring into each other's eyes. See the allure of love. And the things of earth will grow dim. That kind of love transforms our hearts. You see, that is the gospel, and it changes everything. Let's pray.